Thank you very much for joining us today for our panel discussion. We hope that you are all enjoying the 2020 virtual Eritrean Festival in the USA. Today, we are honored to have 4 special guests. These guests are going to be here to speak about Eritrea as a role model with regards to peace building and economic development in the Horn of Africa. Without further ado, I am going to introduce our 4 guests. I am not going to tell of everything that they've done because we will be here for years. They are all of them are very well accomplished. So I am going to briefly introduce our speakers. Before I go to our speakers, I would like to also introduce my co-moderator, Yamane Tawelde, and Yamane will be joining us in the discussion for today. So let's start with our first guest. Our first guest is a very familiar face to all Eritreans, and Ms. Carol Pino. Carol is a journalist. She's a producer, writer and director of documentary films. She has extensive experience in Africa and has specialized in Africa for more than a decade. Her first, actually, documentary film, which is Africa Open for Business, was screened at the Cannes Film Festival and also awarded the Africa Vision Award. It was a documentary that's changed the African narrative. Our second guest is Mr. Gil Kaplan. Gil has been a friend of Eritrea for decades and decades. His first introduction to Eritrea was in the field during the struggle for independence. Gil served in the Republican staff of the African Subcommittee for many years. He was a senior staff member on the House of Foreign Affairs Committee. And in his capacity as the Republican staff on Africa, had the chance to visit Eritrea and has been back to Eritrea multiple times since then. Gil graduated from Brandeis University in Waltham, Massachusetts. He went on to do his studies in Middle Eastern Studies at the University of Chicago. Michael Ralph is our next guest. Michael is a professor at NYU. He teaches in the School of Medicine and Department of Social and Cultural Analysis at NYU. Michael is a recipient of multiple fellowships, the Andrew D. Mellon Foundation, Woodrow Wilson Foundation, Social Science Research Council, just to name a few. He is also an author. He authored Forensics of Capital, and he also has 2 books that are coming up soon. One is titled Life, and the second one is titled Before 13. And our 4th guest, last but absolutely not least, is Benga de Silva. Benga is a George Mason PhD candidate. He is in the School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution. And I think I'm supposed to call it the Carter School of Conflict Analysis and Resolution now. De Silva is passionate about teaching and research in peace building and sustainable development in the Horn of Africa. He has written publications and lectured on these issues that are very close to his heart. He interrogates Western generic solutions to the local developing economies that are challenged in today's world. And he is one of the minds that is willing to understand the ideological formation that forge these solutions to parse the expectation and experience gap. He is interested in understanding the culture of development organizations like the IMF and World Bank. Benga was in Eritrea last year as part of the Mason Study Abroad program, and he will also share some of those experiences with us. So thank you all for joining us today, and we will start with Carol Pino. So Carol, if you could start with your presentation with regards to role of Eritrea in East Africa. Thank you.
Well, first of all, Sepli, thank you so much for having me on the panel. It's such a pleasure to join you all virtually. I wish I could be at the festival in person because it's so much fun and so much energy, but leave it to the Eritreans to have found the next best solution and still do something great. So, the idea of talking about Eritrea as a role model really comes pretty naturally to me. Many people know that I was in Eritrea in 98 at the beginning of the war, and then I moved to Eritrea in 99, 2000. And I've gone back several times. Before Eritrea, I had reported on Africa for about 5 years. But since leaving Eritrea, every single thing that I have done has been inspired by Eritrea and from the lessons that I learned being in Eritrea. So the idea of talking about you all as a role model, you certainly have changed my life. And so it's exciting to think about bringing the example out and showing others what Eritrea has done. I want to go back to a story in 2018, and this is right before the peace agreement was finalized. I was talking to Minister Edefani, the agriculture minister, and he was telling me about these amazing programs in agriculture that the UN had told me were truly groundbreaking, that no one was even close. And I was saying to him afterwards, this is so amazing. So how often do you go to international conferences? I said, I go sometimes. I said, how often are you asked to speak about this? And he laughed and said, come now, Carol, no one wants to hear from the Eritrean minister. And, we both laughed about it. But the reality is, these are solutions that everybody could be using. And that this whole thing around the narrative, in a sense, we have robbed the rest of the world of solutions, and we've robbed Africa of inspiration. I tell people about Eritrea and Eritrean development in particular all the time. And the reaction always from Africans is, how come we never hear about this? How come I don't know about this? These are the kind of stories that I want. The story of Eritrean development is the story of African solutions to African challenges. Eritrea is the purest we may ever see of true, pure African-led development. And it's an extraordinarily inspiring story, especially a story for Africans that they want to hear, they're craving to hear. And so we really need to get that story out there. I know that Eritrea is a role model and it can change the world because I know that it already has. Today in development, the biggest words in development are country ownership, people-based development, demand-driven development, all these fancy terms. Many of you know these terms, but few of you people know that that concept came from Eritrea. After independence, when Eritrea was starting to become part of the global community, it went to the donors. At the time, we called them donors. We didn't call them partners. And the IMF and the World Bank were full on in structural adjustment. Eritrea was a new country. You would think it had no rights at all. It was a little tiny country. It had just come out of war. It was desperate, right? It couldn't say no. No, Eritrea said no and left almost $500 million on the table. The donors were shocked. I've always thought I would love to have been a fly on the wall in that time. But what was interesting was the way that Eritrea did it. It wasn't in malice or anger. It was really, we want to hear your suggestions. We want to hear what you're thinking for us would be good, but we don't agree with your solution. And we fought all that time for our sovereignty, and we're going to exercise it. And we have our own programs and our own priorities. It was shocking. And 2 years later, everyone had said, oh, Eritrea is going to do terribly, right? 2 years later, Eritrea had completely proved itself. It became the darling of everybody. It truly changed the way that development was seen. That's where country ownership, people-based development, all of these terms come from Eritrea. The whole idea of calling all of these institutions development partners, that comes from Eritrea, and Eritrea's insistence that they would not accept the terms donor recipient and these kind of hierarchical terms. This is Eritrea, a small country coming out of war after 30 years, really decimated by that, and yet literally having the power to change the world, to change major institutions, some of the biggest institutions in the world, like the World Bank, the IMF, the UN, with just a simple belief in themselves. It's really extraordinary, and that's what we need to see more of. You know, I believe that the history of Africa before colonialism, that the communal aspects of cultures probably were that Africa was more like Eritrea then than it is now. Unfortunately, power and money changed that. That is the history of colonialism in the post-colonial period. In Eritrea, it has remained. It's the vision of the EPLF, the vision of having a dual revolution of both fighting for independence and for transformation of the country. But the story of Eritrean development is not just a story of Eritrea. It is a story of Africa and what Africa could be and the way forward. This is the story that we have robbed from all of Africa. So when I look at Eritrean development, I look at sort of four aspects: the self-reliance, the social justice, the holistic approach, and that everything is rooted in the 30-year war. There are other things, the issue of taking simple solutions, taking traditional methods and modernizing them, kind of looking forward by looking back, very deliberate, thoughtful solutions. But still, those four aspects of self-reliance, social justice, holistic approach, and rooted in the 30-year war, really to me are key. And the first three, you could really imitate those anywhere. Any government could decide, any people, even without a government, could decide this is the way that they want to live. Anybody could do that. The part that you couldn't do is the 30-year war, obviously. In the 30-year war, Eritrea was forced to find solutions, but it also gave Eritreans pride in having done it themselves. And I think that is what you see of the extraordinary aspect and the commitment and drive that really pushes people forward. It's that feeling like we know we did it before, even with so little resources, and we know we can do it again. I think something is happening in Africa today that offers a small taste of that, and that's with COVID. You know, Eritrea has done more than anybody with COVID. It is unbelievably extraordinary. But COVID isn't a crisis that came from the outside. And by the time that Africa noticed that this was happening, the other countries were really busy with dealing with their own problems. The usual saviors, the US, Europe, others, they were dealing with their own things. So Africans had to look internally and find their own solutions. And they've had to grapple with doing it themselves. But from that, I'm hearing just a small taste of the same pride and confidence that I've always seen in Eritrea. I think that Africa is at a pivotal moment, that after fending for themselves through this massive global pandemic, they feel a little more confident. They're standing a little taller, a little more sure of themselves. And if you're feeling like that, do you go into negotiations differently? Do you say no to the West? Do you say no to China? Do you rely on your own solutions? Do you look at what you could do internally and see that you have your own answers? COVID in Africa today, I think, has given the rest of Africa a small taste to be able to see what it could be like to live as Eritreans have, of believing in themselves, of believing in self-reliance, of believing in a holistic approach, of believing in social justice, and seeing that you can do it yourself. Coming out of this, you know, COVID in Africa has been less of a health crisis and more of an economic crisis. Coming out of it, all of Africa will desperately need Eritrea's example, Eritrea's leadership, to remember the power and potency of what it was like to do it yourself, to have believed in yourself and to have been self-reliant. And this is where I think Eritrea taking a leadership role, being a role model, is so crucial in getting that story out. Which then leads me to the other issue, which is the issue of narrative and how important narrative is in talking about development. We have a way of sort of trashing African countries when there's a success. Well, of course, they're a small country. Well, they could do that because, that's the kind of regime. We have a lot of ways. Well, maybe it's just one time. They couldn't really scale up. The truth is that African successes we don't really notice. But the other part for Eritrea is once a country is labeled a pariah nation, it's almost impossible to move beyond that narrative, whether it was true or not. Whatever you say, it's just seen as defensive. It's no longer seen as something that could really actually be true, should be listened to. We talk about systemic racism in America. The way that we talk about Africa is part of it. And the way that we're talking about Eritrea in particular is part of it. I think that Eritrea needs to force its way to be heard. And it's hard. It's incredibly hard. I'm a journalist. I know it's hard to be heard in a very noisy news environment. But I think it's important to remember that you can't improve the narrative for Eritrea. You have to really annihilate it. You have to destroy this narrative. Because every time you try to just improve a little here and a little there, we all know there are forces that come and counter and push for the other narrative. And so I think it's really essential to really destroy the narrative that has been out there. It was a narrative that was formed as a part of war. It was really using narrative as an act of war. And it's time that that narrative is really annihilated. So I want to remind everyone during the 30-year war, you were outnumbered, you were outgunned, but you had superior tactics. If anyone can do this, it's Eritrea. I have two suggestions for it. I think the first thing is to remember that the problem is not Eritrea, it's the other people saying the narrative, and especially the people just repeating it mindlessly. People can always go to Eritrea, they can engage, they can interview, so why don't they? Instead, it's easier to go ahead with Washington groupthink. You have to talk to them where it hurts, especially with journalists. There's no point in whining about why don't you tell the good news about Eritrea? They don't care. It's not my job as a journalist to tell the good news. I really don't care. But if you tell me as a journalist, you're biased. You're telling a lie by omission. You're not telling the truth. You're just telling Washington groupthink, and it's not at all true. That's something that hurts. That says I'm not a good journalist. And so you have to really push them that they are the ones at fault when they are telling the wrong narrative. But the other thing that I would like to say, and I often, keep myself from ever saying what Eritrea should do, but this is the one time I'm going to say it. What Eritreans should do is Eritrean mothers and fathers should start letting their children brag. You're taught, don't start every sentence with I. You're supposed to be modest. You're living in a world with Americans who say me, 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 me all the time. The narrative is getting killed that way. Eritreans need to be bragging. I often wonder, do Eritreans even realize how unusual they are? How extraordinary? With COVID, you're one of the first to do testing. You reacted so early before there were even cases in Europe. So you had strategic stockpiles. You isolated people. You dedicated hospitals. The UN, WHO, others are calling this a textbook case, exemplary, groundbreaking. In the diaspora, you have the hotline, webinars, community response. Do you realize there's little or nothing of that at other embassies? Do you realize that the Eritrean community centers that you have everywhere, no other embassy, no other African country has that? A couple of ambassadors from Africa talk about their diaspora, but other than one or two, it's not their focus. They don't really meet with them. So what I would say is we need to start bragging about this, that it's okay to talk internally about how to do better. And I know that's the Eritrean way. But you have to give yourself a moment to take a bow, especially out on the world stage. Is Eritrea perfect? Of course not. Is it something special? Absolutely. And does Eritrea have bragging rights? Yes, it definitely does. And so with that, I'm going to leave it. And again, I thank you for having me part of this.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Carol. That was very interesting. Our next speaker is going to be Gil Capin. So Gil, if you're ready, please go ahead and start.
Sure. First, it's always good to be with the Eritrean community. Obviously, we wish it could be in person, but this is the way it is now. And it's good to see you, Carol, my old friend. and all my Eritrean friends, Yamane and Seble, and good to meet Professor Ralph and Benga da Silva. I haven't met you, but I know the work that you've done and that you're doing, and I really appreciate it. I would second what Carol said about the experience of seeing Eritrea firsthand. I had the good fortune of visiting Eritrea during the struggle, and I wish more people could have done that because it really was something incredible to see. What I always tell people is Eritrea is a unique experiment. And even before independence, the institutions and the attitudes that characterize Eritrea today and that we are discussing were being built over many years. I think also there was a conscious effort not to make the same mistakes that other African countries were making. So I think at the beginning of Eritrean independence, maybe there was a certain caution, certain isolation. But because Eritrea was so different, I think it was misunderstood and still is misunderstood. There are some things, like Carol said, there's some things that maybe we would like to see differently. Nobody's perfect. There's things in the United States we'd like to see done differently. But certain things in Eritrea are factual. First, the progress that's been made in so many areas, the incredible progress in health, in education, in development. And in the beginning, Carol talked about the negative narrative. In the beginning of independence, there was actually a lot of positive press. You know, some people might be too young to remember it, or maybe they forgot it, but there was a whole series of incredible articles and reports about Eritrea. I actually have a whole file. I call it Eritrea's greatest hits. It was the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times and NPR. I mean, you name it. That was the narrative at that time. And at some point it changed. Maybe people got bored with that narrative, but it's still on the record. And one I remember in particular, I can't remember if it was a newspaper report or if it was on radio, but there was a report about Eritrea building the railroad, rebuilding the railroad, the Italian railroad between Asmara and Massawa. And I remember the reporter was amazed because as he recounted it and was interviewing some of the old workers that had worked on the Italian railroad and were brought back to build the new railroad, there were bids that were made, and Eritrea sought the advice and the ideas of a lot of outside groups and companies, and a lot of them were very expensive. And as the reporter said it, I wish I had it in front of me, but it was something like, "No thanks, we'll do it ourselves." And that's what they did. And they ended up rebuilding that railroad. And this is something that, of course, is repeated over and over again. There's so many similar examples, but I think this is what Eritrea is all about. But what I always tell people when the subject comes up is that you can't deny certain facts. There's the progress in health, which is, I think, historic, on malaria, on child mortality, maternal mortality, on AIDS, and now, as Carol pointed out, on coronavirus. But also, there's a bottom line here. People don't kill each other in Eritrea over religion. People don't kill each other over ethnicity. That's pretty unique, and that's something to celebrate, and frankly, something to look at closely, to model. Obviously, something that is being done that's right. And also, it's the most stable country in the Horn. You know, all those years, the knock was that Eritrea is unstable and that it's causing instability in the neighborhood. Well, it's the exact opposite. Now Eritrea is the anchor of stability in the Horn of Africa. So I think Eritrea really does have a lot to offer, a lot to teach, and a lot to contribute to its neighbors. And for now, I'll stop with that.
Thank you, Gil. You know, given that your relationship with Eritrea has been decades, right? It started when you were 12, let's say. It's been decades. You know, you bring such a historical perspective to Eritrea's life and its growth in the Horn of Africa, right? From the start of its, from inception of a nation, from the struggle to inception to today. So when we come back to you, we're going to ask you to elaborate a little bit more on that. So start thinking about that, and then we'll get back to you right after, right at the end. So without further ado, we'll go to Professor Michael Ralph. Michael, you're on.
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation to speak here today. I want to thank the other panelists. It's an honor to join you. I've been to Eritrea about 4 times. I've been twice with students from NYU, and I look forward to further research trips and visits, soon. I think, in reflecting on what I want to talk about today, I thought a lot about the recent Nobel Peace Prize award to Ethiopia and to Dr. Abiy Ahmed. And I just want to talk a little bit about the Nobel Peace Prize, like the press release and the events surrounding the award, because I think they point to something very important that our guests have been talking about as well, and that sort of shapes the broader political narratives about Eritrea. In its press release in 2019, October 11th, the Nobel Prize Committee said that, peace does not arise from the actions of one party alone, and yet they gave the award to the Ethiopian Prime Minister, quote, for his decisive initiative to resolve the border conflict with neighboring Eritrea, and so, of course, to those of us who know Eritrean history and politics, and even politics of the region, this is sort of strange because usually when there's a peace prize in a conflict situation, the award goes to both of the sovereign leaders who helped to sort of negotiate that peace, right? Like when Nelson Mandela won a Nobel Prize for helping to resolve apartheid, he split it with the apartheid leader, F.W. de Klerk, right? And so there's a recognition that it took multiple parties to broker the peace. And so, anyone who's aware of what's been happening in the region is aware that Eritrea played at least as significant, but arguably much more significant role in bringing the peace about. And the fact that it was not granted the award speaks more to what we're talking about and this sort of effort to suppress their role in diplomacy and effort to sort of deny them a role as a kind of model, exemplary role in African politics. So I want to talk a little bit more about that because, obviously the key to the peace was the fact that Ethiopia finally acknowledged that for at least 20 years, it had transgressed Eritrea's borders and had sort of refused to accept the formal terms of the peace agreement laid out at independence. And, I think a lot of times there's plenty, every country, could be critiqued and every country has room for improvement. I think what a lot of people don't realize is that Eritrea was well on its way to building what most of us think of as a democratic society. In the immediate aftermath of independence, there were flourishing newspapers, there was a broader public sphere, there was a dramatic drawdown in troops, all kinds of things like that. And it was the Ethiopian aggression at the border that forced Eritrea to have to defend itself, and then people looked at it and criticized it for defending itself, But I think that it's important to look at that. I also think it's important to note the U.S. role in sort of instigating the crisis because all throughout the time when Ethiopia had transgressed Eritrea's borders, in particular that 1998 to 2018 period, the U.S. was celebrating Ethiopia as its ally in the region and as a country that was sort of helping to bring peace in the region, and meanwhile sort of enabling that transgression. And I think it's important to note the role of U.S. foreign policy because I think that actually U.S. foreign policy has been instrumental in many conflicts throughout the world, and often precisely through that strategy of sort of identifying a certain country that's an ally, framing that country as a vehicle of peace in the region, indicting another country as sort of the source of instability in the region, and then criticizing that country or sort of undermining it. And I think thankfully there are some recent changes to U.S. foreign policy that it has not always been as concerned with that particular paradigm of geopolitics, and I think that's good. Also, as I was thinking about the role of the U.S. in particular, I think that there's this quote that many of us are familiar with that sort of goes back to the moment when Eritrea was first federated with Ethiopia, and then ultimately Ethiopia's attempt to colonize it. And there's a quote from the U.S. Secretary of State John Foster Dulles that we're familiar with that said, from the point of view of justice, the opinions of Eritrean people must receive consideration. Nevertheless, the strategic interests of the United States and the Red Sea Basin and considerations of security and world peace make it necessary that this country has to be linked with our ally, Ethiopia. And so what I think is most interesting about that phrase is that in that phrase, John Foster Dulles is calling security a world peace, he recognizes that it's not justice. Like on the one hand, you have justice, what the Eritrean people want. On the other hand, you have security and world peace. And even in his own terms, security and world peace is a different consideration than justice. And I think that's worth thinking about. And I think, one thing that's often not talked about that was happening in that moment is that the U.S. was already at that time using the sort of military installation that would be called Canyo Station, because prior, the Italian naval radio station, what was called Radio Marina, it was selected because it had a very high altitude and it was both a good source of communications, and also it gave the opportunity to surveil the region because of such a high altitude. And the U.S. was very interested in keeping that military installation and using Eritrea as a kind of site for surveillance and communications network. And so it was using Canyo Station since 1943. So even when John Foster Dulles said that in 1952, the U.S. had already been in Eritrea for several years and wanted to hold on to that strategic position and didn't even leave until 1977 when, through the successes of the freedom fighters, the U.S. realized that it may not be able to hold that military installation and eventually sort of packed up and left. But I mentioned these events to sort of highlight the fact that really at the heart of the conflict was sort of Ethiopia's unwillingness to accept the terms of the peace, and even the fact that the instability in that conflict was instigated by external actors like the United States. And that I think at the heart of this is a particular narrative that's been created about Eritrea, a false narrative that this country is a source of instability, when in fact it's a model of sort of what it means to be determined in the pursuit of freedom and to work to sustain that freedom. And one thing I think we could talk about in the Q&A is that even some of the things that people have raised concerns about, like mandatory military service and at times it being extended, are directly linked to these things. But ultimately, the decision to use military service and civil service as the basis of the jobs program has actually led to several decades of economic stability for Eritrea. I think that's partly why the state is able to employ so many people and also to be able to defend its territorial sovereignty because of this particular sort of configuration of both military service, civil service, and also the government finding ways to employ people in sort of developing and building up the country. When I was there, I was struck by all the reforestation projects, like people planting trees and things like that. And I was told that even reforestation is part of civil service, that you get credit for things like that. So I think a lot of African countries can learn from the model of using civil service to develop and enhance and revitalize the country. And I guess the last thing I want to point out is that all throughout the period of sort of the no war, no peace period, President Isaias had been giving speeches where he expressed a genuine confusion and surprise about why Ethiopia was even transgressing the border, and even why other people seemed not to be pointing it out. And he talked a lot about how, in order to establish legitimacy first to the people of Eritrea, there was a referendum, and they had the referendum witnessed by the international community. And they talked about how like the border designation had been archived in a repository, so the whole international community, diplomatic world could see what the border was supposed to be. And I thought that was very important, that he was giving these speeches with very specific evidence about how Eritrea had worked to develop and secure political legitimacy, because sometimes there's a criticism that the government doesn't seem to care what other people think. And I think nothing could be further from the truth, that there was a lot of steps taken to make sure that they pursued a path that would be recognized as legitimate, that the people would buy into governance, that the international world would be able to observe and recognize what the country is doing. And so I think, to Eritrea's credit, the government has been very determined in sort of trying to pursue this path to political legitimacy, and despite various kinds of criticism and other kinds of narratives, has persevered, and I would argue, and I think our other panelists would also agree, prevailed in many respects. And I think that what we're witnessing in many ways is kind of the flourishing of all of that hard work, the hard work of 30 years, 50 years, depending on how you think of it, many decades and many countless sacrifices. But I think it would be interesting to talk about what's next and how we see the current landscape. And I look forward to further discussion in the Q&A.
Thank you, Michael. So we will move on to Binga de Silva. Binga will give us a different perspective from Carol and Gil and Michael, with regards to the self-driven and self-propelled peace building and sustainable development. So Binga, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate this. It's very interesting that we're all talking about Eritrea now, specifically at this time when the world is dealing with COVID-19. And we're not just talking about Eritrea, we're talking about how Eritrea has over the years been able to do things differently as an African country and differently as political hegemonic consciousness of what Africa really is, as far as I'm concerned. Talking about self-driven and self-propelled peace building, I think I want to start by encouraging us to start reimagining the way we conceive words like peace, the way we conceive words like peace building. The idea that goes into peace building these days would always have to do with a third-party intervention, which is what the world really thinks it should be. Yes, there is the right to protect. I understand that, but I feel that the global South has over the years been repressed. They've made the global South, that is the West has made, the global North has made, they've inculcated this, what I call colonial mentality for Africans to believe that, look, you don't get things solved without our help. So as a consequences of years of slavery and then colonialism itself. And post-colonialism has yielded itself to Africans living the realities of the West. So they feel that globalization would have to do with opening up your borders and letting us plow your resources and things like that. Because of that, I feel it's important for us to reimagine the way we think about the concept of peace building. What is peace building? For me, it is processual. It's not about two countries inviting the third one to come and oversee conversations. No. How do adults deal with their problems? They talk it out. You don't find a husband and a wife invite the next door neighbor to come and intervene in their situation. No. Most of the time when that happens, it deteriorates the kind of relationship that exists between the husband and the wife. But the notion that we've been ingrained with is, look, you don't solve this problem until you have a third-party intervention. And that is the way the world defines their peace building. That is not what peace building is, and that is not what it should be. It is process. And I feel so strongly that Eritrea is taking that. Eritrea has been going through that over the years, and that's the reason why it feels it is against the world, because it's doing things that the world is not doing. So that is one. I also feel so strongly that when you have the right process that you are using to engage your peace building, what it yields is sustainable development. You cannot do things haphazardly and expect it to be sustained. You can't do things haphazardly and expect some level of sustenance. No, it's not going to last. As a result, I have seen that with Eritreans. I've seen that ideologically based execution, strategic planning that has gone into the civil service, that has gone into the industry. Unfortunately, because we have misplaced priorities, our generation has their priorities really misplaced. We would rather want to support concepts that we have clearly no idea about, as against something that is steeped in that culture, that African culture, that communal, the communal way we live, the communal way we do things. We forget about that and we say, oh, okay, that skyscraper in Ethiopia should be what we should be gunning for, as if building big, bridges and all of that signify the mark of prosperity. Because what I think about when I look at people is, what is going on in the mind of an undergraduate, a new college undergraduate? For the good ones that are probably under pressure at home, they want to make out a good grade. But for the ones that have really, really been starved of freedom, they want to explore and go, let's go clubbing on Fridays, let's go enjoy ourselves and things like that. So priorities are different, and we need to acknowledge that. So what is the priority of that intervener coming from, an excellent intervener coming into this situation? What is the person's interest? Is it in the interest of the region? Is it in the interest of his capitalist industrialists that are coming to plow our natural resources. Countries like Nigeria have had that to contend. In the name of globalization, what are we doing to our culture? What are we doing to that African culture? Because I think we should always have something tangible, something strong, something holistic to fall back on. If we are criticizing colonialism, but yet we're ready to absorb and sink in the narrative of the West against Africans that we're backward, and you're saying colonialism is evil, but yet you're taking certain things that continues to put us at the backdrop of, to relegate us to the backdrop. We want to imbibe that. That doesn't make much of a sense as far as I'm concerned in 2020. I think that the Eritrean youths need to have that responsibility. A lot of them do, to actually be that mentor for other African youths, where when you speak and interact with them, the way they imagine things and the way they talk about issues is original. So no one will tell me that, yeah, the reason why I feel I'm not happy is because we don't have skyscrapers. You don't have skyscrapers, but you got your tuition fee sorted out. A lot of Americans are dealing with, college tuitions, and a lot of them are in debt. That is a system that gives you access to education right from birth up to college. So you tell me that, is that not development? Is that not something that some African leaders should look up to and try to emulate? So I think the work of peace building, as far as the youths are concerned, should be more of nation building. Let us have them project the image of Eritrea as it is. Like, here is a country. I'm not owing student loan. I'm not owing anything. I'm fine. I'm doing well. But there are some people here that are still dealing with the issues of minimum wage. So things like that, we need to look at how it's constructive for us to engage a particular solution in a particular space, because that solution is responding to the specific problem. So we cannot transfer solutions that has worked over the years in the West and hope that it's going to work in Africa. It's the responsibility of Africans to develop the continent. It is not the responsibility of anybody from outside to do that for us, because it is not African. I think I'm going to stop there before I start digressing.
Thank you very much, Benga. We could do an open mic, and let's open it up to our panelists to ask away or build upon thoughts and ideas that have been brought up.
I'd like to start with this. I want to go back to something that Professor Ralph mentioned. It's about national service. I think that's a perfect example to look at how the narrative went askew, because let me put it this way. We have a local newspaper here that gives out Pinocchios for politicians if they don't tell the truth. I think the coverage of Eritrea probably deserves a million Pinocchios, because it's a shame, because there could be such a constructive dialogue and constructive criticism about real issues, but the coverage has been so bad, so over the top, so untrue, that it takes away all perspective. On the issue of the national service, for example, I don't know how that started becoming such a negative thing in the popular eye. This is a wonderful thing. I've been to Sawa. I know what they do there. It's a tremendously positive thing, not only from the point of view of the contributions that Sawa makes to national development, but even in terms of bringing the nation together. You're taking a country that has 9 ethnic groups and bringing them together. That's one of the achievements of Sawa. You're bringing people together. Maybe that's why you don't have the problem of religious violence and ethnic violence, because people are learning to work together. And Sawa is something that everybody participates in, even the president's son, the minister's sons, everyone and daughters, they all go to Sawa, and it's a tremendously positive experience. Unless there's something hidden that I don't know about, I started going there early on, when I think during the first year when they had it. It's an incredibly good thing, and frankly, something that should be emulated by other countries.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I love how you talk about it, and that was my experience too in visiting Eritrea and talking to people about their experience at Sawa. They all raved about it, and credited with so much. You know, like learning languages spoken in other regions. You know, understanding other kinds of religions better. You know, um, and it's interesting. I think one of the challenges, and I think is something that somehow a lot of journalists covering Eritrea don't feel like they even need evidence for some of their claims. I think that's one of the problems, you know. So, and even members of the diaspora, oftentimes when they're critical about something like Sawa, people kind of like repeat like certain kinds of nightmare scenarios they've heard over and over again over the years. There's no details, there's no empirical basis. It's almost kind of like certain legends that people hear and just tell it. Almost like give them a telephone, it gets more and more exaggerated over time. And I think, you know, whenever I hear things that seem really outrageous and fabricated and completely defy what I've experienced through research or visits, I wonder like why even people give so much credence to anecdotal evidence at all, you know? Like if you were to ask the average American in rural South what they thought of Barack Obama, you wouldn't write like an international news story based on what like a rural person who was not necessarily well educated, not necessarily well informed about political issues said about the president. You know, you wouldn't, but in the case of Eritrea, people do take that as evidence. Anything any family member ever said, anything any newspaper ever suggested, even without empirical evidence. I think there's like a problem of sort of not even bothering to verify sources, not even bothering to do serious research and just sort of circulating myths and rumors and legends and taking that as fact.
I also think that a lot of us have jettisoned the purpose of history. Don't we don't know our history, and for the few that know have learned about the history, they probably just glossed over it and feel that it's important for them to be in support of what the world believes it is. Meanwhile, everything that is happening either in Africa or elsewhere is by design. You have a system of capitalism that revolted against feudal, Europe, and so you have that system learn and evolve. The evolution of the Western civilization happened. But while that of Africa was happening, it was truncated by all the series of, say, slavery and colonialism and what have you. I feel that we don't understand history because when you say you're castigating national service, what African country I need to know that African country that doesn't operate one form of national service or another. Even the United States operate national service, right? So, and then you have a country that is not as big. It's not a big country. It's a small country, but yet it has to work. It has to have good road. It has to have dams. It has to have amenities, social amenities, create security and all of that. How do you want a country to run on very minimal number of people, and yet you're saying citizens should not contribute in whatever way to the growth of that country? I don't understand. So you're saying, okay, the best way to do it is let's bring in NGOs and let's flood the country with NGOs and so. Meanwhile, a lot of NGOs, what goes into their overhead costs is far more than what the communities need. So we need to understand that the way these things work, especially when it comes to understanding what makes a particular country different from the other, it takes patience. And I feel the difference between the West and the global South is the differences in ideology. We need that national service because it serves that purpose. You don't find insecurity. There is no form of insecurity in Eritrea. You don't have cops lurking around in corners.
Yeah, I mean, there's one thing. Several of the panelists touched on how peaceful it is, and I was shocked. My students were shocked just by how peaceful Eritrea is, and what's interesting is there were just happened to be NYU students who went to Ethiopia at the same time my students went to Eritrea, and
Oh yeah.
in Ethiopia they had to have armed guards in certain places they went. It was like really, and there's some places they weren't even allowed to go because it was too dangerous. And when they came back and told their friends how peaceful Eritrea is, no one believed them. They're like, we can't believe you guys can just walk
Yeah.
around and it's peaceful and safe, and that just speaks to the narratives. But I do want to mention two things that I think are salient and build on what all the panelists have said and the brilliant insights of our panelists. So one is, I think Eritrea might be the only country that I know of that came into independence like from colonial rule and didn't have any debt, you know? And I think not being in debt to begin your independence, it was because of the discipline of not wanting to take loans, but also that sort of period between 91 and 93 when like the Freedom Fighters and various people were sort of essentially working for free
Yeah.
to set up the country. It does create a lot of challenges, obviously, like it's hard work, as you were saying, I think most people, even I, can't even really fathom how much work it takes to build a country from scratch. You know what I mean? I
That
think
is
that's,
it.
and since we never see that, we can't really fathom it. So
That is the
so
point.
when I talk to people, when I say like, okay, they criticize, people in the diaspora, various people might criticize the country. I'm like, well, okay, so your country fought 30 years, liberated itself, and it was built from scratch, and this and this and that, and I'm like, no other African country has done that, and they'll say, well, I'm not comparing it to another African country. That's and I'm like, that's kind of funny because I understand what they're saying. They're saying there's certain things they want to see, they haven't seen it, and they don't care if what I'm saying is that this thing is utterly unprecedented. They still want to see what they want to see, and I guess that's their right. But I'm just saying, in the context of African history, in the context of world history, it's a remarkable accomplishment, remarkable achievement, and it would take like millions of people working overtime
Mhm.
and making tremendous sacrifices to do it, so, and not having had to be the ones to make those sacrifices. I understand that some people might be frustrated, but all I can do is kind of be in awe of it and marvel at it, and want to tell people what I've witnessed because it's so unprecedented and so monumental.
One final thing. It's unfair for people to expect, for an adult to expect a toddler to work in his or her space. It's just so unfair. Like you cannot compare Eritrea of a 30-year-old country with a country that is like a century old. It's unfair because you're asking like a 2-year-old baby to run after an adult or a sprinter. It's just not right. We need to redefine development within the space. If you want to compare Eritrea with Nigeria. Let us see what Eritrea has done when it comes to education, when it comes to this national service, and what Nigeria has done when it comes to education, agriculture, or national service, and then compare. That will be fair. But you can't say Eritrea versus, say, London or America. It is so unfair. And just we need to be very reasonable when we're thinking about these things.
In a way, we are, as an Eritrean, we are lucky that when the EPLF came to the power, they had a chance to really start up from scratch. We had nothing. Ethiopians government during Haile Selassie, they were taking all the resources that Eritrea had, all the factories, they dismantled it. All the Africa that connects Massawa and Asmara, they just took it out and sold it to some other countries. So in a way, Eritrea was blessed that they got EPLF from start and build a country that we are lucky in that sense, because other African countries, they didn't, most of them, the colonizer gave them their independence, pseudo-independence. They didn't even give them the real independence. So that's the issue, and continued to this date, exploiting their resources. So Eritrea is new and trying to build something. They ask for equitable income share. So partnership, by the way, they coined that word, partnership. That's how they started. Okay, let's be partner. I'll be fair. You give me your share, you take your share. But this people, capitalists, when they come, well, why do we do that? So we pay so and so country only 10%, then you're asking me 50%? How do we do this? You know, so this is a new paradigm, and Eritrea stick to it and doing it on their own. They just, you know, amazing how many dams, how many, you know, water resources, how many roads they built, just like they were in the struggle time. So it's a good thing, but now how do we jump in? How do the youth get into this? And we don't have to be quiet. You know, the narrative has to go in the universities and different places where Eritreans are and understand other African brothers and sisters are. That's the next step. How to take it, this experience. That's the struggle we have. And again, it's gonna get there. We have good youth. We're trying our best. But thank you for all the comments from all of you. So maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, I appreciate what you're saying. And I think two things. Well, one, I'm always really impressed by how the government views the diaspora, both like as a resource and even when the diaspora is critical. I think government officials and various people just take the critiques and incorporate them, and they still want to have those conversations. So that's very impressive to me that even with the criticism, the one thing one of the other things I want to mention, 'cause I think is very important about Eritrea is like, and this is, people cited this in the COVID response, is the importance of mobilization. And I guess two things: that one, the mobilization, and also the broader sustainable vision. Like when you ask people, you know, veterans and people who, you ask them about why they made certain decisions 20, 30, 40 years ago, they'll say, well, we wanted it to be sustainable. We wanted it to be sustainable. And I'm like, what does it mean to be in the trenches and decide your vision of government is sustainable? You know, like most people would have been acting out of desperation, like, oh, we'll do whatever we have to do to get whatever we need to get. But they were like, oh no, if we want this to last well into the future, it has to be sustainable. And I think even every kind of campaign, whether it's malaria campaign, whether it's anti-female genital cutting, whether it's COVID, it's about extensive mobilization. It's like these people go here, mobilize these people, go here, mobilize these people. And I think there are very few countries and contexts where people are so dedicated and so expert at mobilization. I mean, the only time most Americans mobilize is around political campaigns, and even then, it's not the same extent of mobilization, you know. But like the idea of just for every major social problem, social issue, going deep into the country, into the countryside, and making sure you share the information and making sure, you know, it's just really kind of a remarkable approach that, you know, I think in the U.S. people are used to debating issues and publishing articles on issues, but like the decision to make sure every single issue will be mobilized around, that's how you show you're committed to an issue, is to go out and try to reach people. You know, that's a very sort of impressive.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, Michael, because there was mention of meeting the sustainable goals, the Millennium Development Goals, the Sustainable Development Goals of the UN, and Eritrea really had excellent, impressive results. Unfortunately, though, that is not as talked about as the negative narrative that we hear. And even, you know, I'm noticing that as we talk, even though we've got all the positives in our minds of Eritrea, we have the tendency of, you know, referring back to what they've said about us, right? So, you know, that psychological containment of that thought has impacted us as well, right? So we need to kind of work our way into adjusting away from that. But one of the things that I think has been very successful for Eritrea is cultural identity, right? Whether it's the Sawa, whether it is the grassroots initiatives that's taken to change or shift situations within the country. It's the whole, you know, somebody mentioned about, you know, I think it was Gil mentioned, you know, that there were 9 ethnicities within the Eritrean nation. But we don't even think about that because of the identity that ties us as Eritreans. So that thought, that strength of self-identity makes us, and I say this humbly because I haven't done a quarter of what a lot of people have done for this nation, right? But it gives us that confidence or that encouragement to make a difference, to ensure that there is fairness and equitable access to everything within the nation.
I mean, there are just so many things. This discussion has been fabulous, and Michael and Benga, I'm going back to school so I can be in your classes. So, but one thing, Gil, one thing that I've always been envious of you for is that until 2018, I had never seen Eritrea not at war. To have seen it before then, I'm so envious of you of having had that time of seeing the guys in the trenches. Like when I hear about, I was sitting in a meeting with a minister and I was saying about, before in the 30-year war, they said, well, you should ask my colleague. He was the minister during the conflict. A minister in the trenches? Are you serious? Like, who were you guys? And Gil, I just would love to hear, like, when you saw it, what made you look at it and say, this is something special? This is different than what the usual is. Like, how did that, as a Westerner, how did it register for you? It's like, wow, this is unique.
And Gil, if I can add to that, if you could also add, because you have a very unique perspective, like Carol said, it starts, pre-independence and pre-liberation. So in answering Carol's question, if you could add to it the life cycle of the Eritrean narrative, right? And where we were and where we are, and why the hostility. Thank you.
I'm happy to do it. That's a lot to unpack, but let me try to do that. First of all, this whole question about mobilization and these incredible achievements that we're seeing in this unique way that Eritrea operates, the most impressive thing about it from my point of view is that this has continued throughout all these years. The same things that we're seeing now, same things that are so impressive to us and that we're discussing, this is what I saw and what impressed me all those years ago. And one thing I really enjoy is listening to people who are discovering Eritrea, going to Eritrea for the first time, and seeing really is believing. And I have to tell you about this incredible evening that we had. And I think we all know Carol put together this incredible program at George Mason. And we have one of the products, Benga is here. And I was there the night that we had this great evening at the Eritrean Club, where every single one of them got up and talked about their own impressions of Eritrea. And it was really not only heartwarming, but it was so incredibly moving to hear their own impressions. And I can't say it enough, seeing is believing. So yeah, I was fortunate because at a very early stage, I got to see what was happening in the field. And what impressed me is the fact that I was able to put it into context, because at that time, and I don't want to cast aspersions about other countries, we're talking about our own experience here, and we want other countries to learn the positive things. But I really did have contacts, experience with other rebel groups, with other countries, and Eritrea was so obviously different in the ethos, the morale of the people, the integrity of the people, the self-reliance of the people. It was just impossible to compare it. And again, I'm not going to go into details, but I did travel quite a bit in Africa, and I did have something to compare it to. The first time I crossed the border from Sudan, we came across a prisoner of war camp at Karora, right across the border from Sudan. And we talked to some Ethiopian prisoners of war. Some of them were kids, like 14, 16-year-old kids. And I was so struck by the way that they were being treated with such a humane attitude by the EPLF. They were being fed, they were being clothed, they were being educated. And I said to the fighters that we were traveling with, I said, why are you treating them so well? They're eating as much as you are, and they're having access to the same things that you are, you're teaching them. And they said something very interesting. They said, look, we don't blame them. They're being forced to fight against us. And also, we're looking towards the future. They're going to be our neighbors. We have to work with them. We want to establish a good relationship with them. And it was starting right there. So this was one of many things that I saw that really impressed me, and that all these years later, I still think about that. The thing is about Eritrea is, and again, I've yet to meet somebody who goes to Eritrea and doesn't come away impressed. It's just a fact. But because it was so unique, And because it was almost a test case of a different model, it was kind of like a bad example for Africa and a bad example for the international community, because it proved that it could be done in a different way. It was, I think, a living testimony to the failures in other places. And also, frankly, I think that for the international aid industry, Eritrea didn't make sense. You know, I'm saying that to be charitable. Maybe it just didn't make sense to them. But in actuality, I think Eritrea is an example of a model that could put them out of business. And maybe subconsciously, they didn't like that. Here's a country that's doing so much for itself, is not have its hand out begging for assistance all the time, is trying to solve its own problems. And this is a bad example for, you know, for other countries maybe that don't want to change that model. And it also doesn't compute for, frankly, for people in the West, in the United States, at USAID, at, you know, the huge world of the aid industry, because maybe they like it that way. They like being in a position of doing favors for other people, of having other people dependent on them. I hope I'm not being too harsh, but I think that there's something to that. And that's why today, with the achievements that we see in Eritrea and the new situation that we have, where Eritrea can be a role model for other countries in the region, that's why it's so important to have an honest discussion about that and really look at ways that Eritrea can, I mean, Eritreans are modest, so I don't never see Eritreans going around preaching or trying to change other countries, but I think that there's certainly something that can be learned from the successes in so many areas of the Eritrean people. And by the way, all this criticism of the government, the EPLF, the PFDJ, people forget that PFDJ comes from the people. And this is another thing that struck me when I was there. Everybody was the EPLF. The EPLF were the sons and daughters of the common people. And even today, there's, to a great extent, this is still true.
You know, Gil, I have on my screen a quote from Thomas Keneally saying, you guys, the Eritreans, succeed using your principles of self-reliance. You'll be an embarrassment to Africa. These guys, the Eritreans, are astounding, running all this. And you know what? The world hates them for it. And the world's hooked into the idea of the helpless Africans. And it's, I don't know when this was written. It must have been 20 years ago, but it's so true. We're so locked into this.
I think it comes from Tuaz Mara.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. It must have been 20 years ago, but it's about that. But we're so hooked into that. Yeah, and it's impossible to get out. And I think there is, if I can be a little harsher than you were a little polite on the NGOs, but, you know, Benga, when we were together and we were listening to the different UN agencies talking about Eritrea, and remember, anybody who works in development in Eritrea is in awe of them. But there was one guy who was really quite annoyed, and he was talking about, like, every time you want to go and build a school, like, they have to get the community together, and they have to talk to the community, and they have to, like, do all these things with the community, and it's such a waste of time. Like, we just build a school.
That's democratic.
Yeah, and I thought, yes, because if you're an NGO, your job is to tick the box. Yes, I built this many schools. It's not to have the longevity of the school there. It's not to make sure that the parents will, in fact, send their children to school there. It's just to say, I built 15 schools in the country. And so really the Eritrean model for an NGO is really a waste of time, and it's really an annoyance. But the fact is that's how development actually happens. You know, and it's these two different models, and one is really built as a business and unregulated government contractors, because this is coming from government money. So, and we have no regulation over what CARE or Save the Children does in their programming. But, you know, there's no government oversight, even though it's government funding, versus what happens when a government is in charge of their own development. And, you know, when you have the Save the Children care model, you know, well, we do education, we don't do healthcare. You know, governments are responsible for the entire thing. And really, if you look on the ground, do people wake up in the morning and say, well, it's Tuesday, it's my education day, I don't really care about health today. Tomorrow I'll care about health. Like, you know, all these things affect your life completely, holistically. And it's only a government that can look at it holistically. But we severed the relationship of the government and development by inserting the NGOs. And that's where I think Eritrea is just this model that is at one point, you know, unbelievable and exciting to learn about. And on the other hand, from the NGO perspective, it's terrifying. So,
You know, it's amazing. I work with the National Union of Eritrean Women, and they partner with UNDP and other NGOs to work on projects, internal projects. And I think it was maybe 3 years ago or so, we were having a meeting, and the UNDP representative was talking about how the project came about, and how Eritrea was an example, or the National Union of Eritrean Women was an example on how it efficiently and effectively used the funds available, and how it can measure the outcome of the project. And that's not something that's very easily attainable. And you have that narrative internally, right? You have those comments and you have those discussions, and you've got the eyewitness players who will come out and say, Eritrea is effective in how it uses its funding and where it puts it from a perspective of being advantageous to most of the people. Yet we still hear the overall general narrative not to be that reality, right? So it's frustrating, but like Carol said, it has to be destroyed. It's not about improving the narrative, but it has to be destroyed. And while we're there and destroying that narrative, right, in order to have the good stories come out, to have the success stories of Eritrea be the true and the realistic signifier of how things are being lived, in order for us to impact positively, whether it is the impact of Horn of Africa in peace building and economic development, or nation building, whether it is impacting Africa as a whole, that narrative has to change, right? And we have to destroy that narrative. So keeping that narrative in mind, and keeping in mind the successes of Eritrea, if you could, all of you, provide us some input, some of your thoughts on how or where you think the link is. How do we link narrative and peace building and economic development and nation building? And I know it's a huge, vast topic, but let's simplify it into one or two thoughts from each of you.
When the Wi-Fi situation is stronger in Eritrea, I think it'll benefit the country, because I think that, when people visit and they post pictures of architecture or art that they've seen, people can't believe it. It's like, it's awe-inspiring, So I think the Wi-Fi situation will benefit the country. But I also think that, interestingly, one thing that Eritrea really excels in is in medicine, and kind of almost like, I would say like technology and medicine or something like that. Medicine in the sense that, the public healthcare system is really good. Also, a lot of people in the diaspora work as nurses and various things like that. But then I also think, like, I've met students who had built computers that were like, it costs $50, $75 for the parts, and they built like whole computers, things like that. And I just think that there's so much ingenuity there, that's the kind of thing that if someone was to invest money in it, it can really take off, because Eritreans do a lot with a little, but what if they had a lot more to work with, right? I think it would be impressive. So my thought about what would change is, I think the Wi-Fi situation could open up new possibilities, including investments and projects that people have ongoing, and not like in a way that's predatory, that some major corporations making all the money, but I think there could be like ways that people who have capital but don't have the ingenuity could partner with young people and try to have the ingenuity and do amazing things.
I'll go next. One thing that we haven't really touched on that much, although Professor Ralph just alluded to it, is the incredible relationship between the Eritrean diaspora and the folks back home. This is obviously something that's not new. This is something that's been going on now for generations, but it's one of the secrets of the strength of the Eritrean society. Obviously, people that are watching us now are a big part of it. There's so many examples of it. I think there should be a hall of fame probably of great Eritreans, Eritrean Americans, and other Eritreans around the world that have given so much to help in building Eritrea, even putting their careers on hold, putting their lives on hold, going back home for years at a time to help build the country. But what I would say in general is that the situation that we have today is despite the challenges, is much different than what existed, say, 10 years ago. As we've been discussing, there's been this bias or animus against Eritrea. And to a great extent, I think we can agree there's been a vindication. 10 years ago, the State Department was saying pretty openly that Eritrea is hopeless, it's unstable, it's causing trouble in the neighborhood. There's no point even in dialogue. We have to wait until President Isaias is gone. We can't talk to him. We'll have to wait for new leadership. So it's important to recognize that and at the same time to take advantage of the new situation that exists now. Eritrea is recognized as a positive force, even by key people in the U.S. government. Certainly a positive force with a role to play in the Horn, a lot to contribute. So definitely, I think that this is a role that should be played. It's good for Eritrea and for its neighbors. I think that there's a role to play in mediation, in mutual development, and even I think possibly some point in the near future, maybe contributing Eritrean troops to peacekeeping. Why not? These are disciplined, well-educated, good soldiers. I think they have a lot to offer. It's something that I think we can foresee in the future. But in general, I would summarize by saying Eritrea might be a small country, but it certainly has a big role to play in the region with all its neighbors.
I think you said we should destroy the narrative. In my own opinion, I think we should rather deconstruct the narratives, especially picking on the talking points. National service is negative. Okay, this is 101 reason why national service is positive, and this is the reason why it works for us. So that way we deconstruct the basis, the human right basis for that. We talk about agriculture. This is what we're doing regarding agriculture. So I think that we should constructively respond to this, because in a way it will be like I'm cutting them some slacks, right? So I'm not saying you don't understand, but I'm trying to make you understand. And here is how you can understand, because national service may not work for you now because you're not in that position, right? You've gone past several of these experiences, but this is a new country that is trying to build. I am sure that this developed beautifully tarred roads that we ride on today were not the same way in 1516, or it took time, it took planning, right? So we don't have to rush, just like some others have rushed, and at the end of the day, they've got nothing to show for it. So I think we need to, for me, I would say that we deconstruct, pick those, talking points, and then deconstruct them by telling them that this is the way you see it. Yeah, I understand it, but this is the way we are seeing it. And it won't really make sense for you to impose your lens on mine, because we need to understand and reach a place of compromise for us to be able to move forward. That's that. I also think that youths within and without have a lot to contribute to nation building, because their fathers, not even grandfathers, their fathers fought in the trenches. When we're talking about some civilization, we're talking of great grandfathers. Here, those who fought for freedom are still fathers. They have kids who are just, so we're not talking of descendants. We're talking of second generation fathers, right? So they fought in the trenches.
Yeah, mothers.
Yeah, and mothers, Ross. Sorry, I don't want to. I am so sorry. Yes, I mean, yeah, thank you for that, for correcting me, with
Yeah,
that.
only
So
because in Eritrea is mothers too. Not in every
mothers
country.
too, yeah, they
Not in every
carried
country.
guns.
But
Yeah,
mothers.
yeah, sure. So that we need to understand that they've contributed their own quota to nation building. Now it's your turn to pick it up. And we have the social media. You mentioned, Professor Michael, you mentioned the idea that if they open up the internet, making it faster, that would help. It would definitely help. And it would also encourage people to do that, because we have the social media now that we can use to actually propagate and project the true story and the true narrative of Eritrea.
You know, Venga, I love that you say, no, it's not destroy, it's deconstruct. And as usual, I stand corrected from what you say. I do think it's really interesting because, I think everyone has talked about national service. And I think the thing, there are two issues. One is the construction of national service, which I think was phenomenal. And the idea that this is not just a military force, but this is a development force. I've never heard of that anywhere else. It's really an amazing thing. The issue, of course, is that it has been, because of the war, indefinite national service. And that's where, this has led to an opening where the UN can come in with their reports of human rights abuses, everything else. But what we need to do is turn it back on the people who are saying this narrative. If you don't like indefinite national service, and I haven't met a single person from the top of the government down in Eritrea who does like it, but if you don't like it as the Western powers, then why didn't you force a peace solution? The only reason why it was indefinite was because this war was continuing. The US, the UN, the AU were all the enforcers of that agreement. Why didn't they enforce it? Why weren't there sanctions against Ethiopia? That would have made it so you didn't have to have the indefinite national service. And this is where I think there has to be, this is the destroying of it, the annihilation of it. Enough of this saying, well, Eritrea has indefinite national service. Yes, because the enforcers did not come in and enforce. They didn't do their job. And I think there's, this is where I see a lot of things that come out. I saw a report just recently on COVID, and it put Eritrea in with the group of Tanzania and Burundi. And I'm sorry, Gil, I know we shouldn't name names, but seriously, these are two countries that are denying there even is COVID. And then you have Eritrea that even before there was a case in Europe was already replenishing their strategic stockpiling. They were getting ventilators. They were instructing people. You look in the US at the number of Eritreans who have caught COVID and the percentage of that have died of COVID. You are so much safer to be in Eritrea than to be in America getting COVID. I believe there have been 21 deaths of Eritreans in America from COVID, 0 in Eritrea. These are the kinds of things where we need to really fight this narrative, because otherwise what happens is people, like me, I'm out there saying things, but then people say, yes, but and then we get all the Washington groupthink. We need to fight that groupthink, and we need to change that narrative. And the last thing I just want to say is, nature abhors a vacuum. And if you're going to change the narrative, you can't just say this is the wrong narrative. What do you want to fill that narrative with? And I think there are a million good things that I could come up with personally, and I'm sure every Eritrean could come up with them. What do you want to fill them with? What do you want to be identified with? Who do you want the world to say that you are? And they're amazing things. And this is where the role model part really comes out.
That's a whole lot of thoughts and ideas that's come out. Has it been an hour or two? The time has flown by,
I just like to greatly admire and appreciate the time you dedicated, busy time, all of you. And we are blessed to have you as a return friend. And all the comments and the points you bring up, hopefully will disseminate to our youth and use them and understand them. Many, many good advices. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. On behalf of the Organization of Eritrean Americans here, I'd like to really appreciate all the contribution you put in. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. And I would like to add, in addition to, the thank yous and my sincere appreciation for, your time. The organizing committee for the festival is very happy that we have you as the panelists to discuss these issues. And as we thought, we have, a plethora of expert knowledge, information, perspective, your experiences that have been shared with us. And what I was thinking while, we were all talking is there's so much there, there's so much that has come out from just this, these couple of hours. How much can we do and how much more discussions could there be in the future? So be prepared, because I think you will be invited back. And to have continuous discussions and also include others, so that we can share the story of Eritrea and we can learn and also grow from each other, and also be able to ensure that the correct narrative is out there. So thank you again, and this concludes our program, our panelists.